Well, the situation in South Korea seems to be stabilizing after the president declared martial law against protesting citizens. He quickly backed off the declaration, and then legislators from the opposing party had to muscle their way past the country's military into their parliament building to vote against the move. To help us understand the situation, we're going to bring in North Central College political science professor William Muck. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
So how does this impact the U.S., if at all?
Well, this is a really big deal for the United States because as we think about how the United States has pursued its strategic interests against China, South Korea and Japan are central players. So the United States has a very, very close military relationship, in particular with President Moon. So the Biden administration has really been working closely with South Korea. So any sort of domestic disruption could potentially threaten that. So this is very, very much in our interest as we think about China and North Korea.
I'm so glad that you broke that down because that was the first question when I heard this. But what does this mean? Okay, you answered that question. South Korea is an important ally of the U.S., but at the same time, they're also an ally of China. Could we see a shift in those relationships if the current president is ousted?
Absolutely. Right now, I think it's likely that South Korea is still going to prefer the United States, but all of these things are potentially moving, right? And China would love to have a much closer relationship with South Korea. And some of the tension between the president and the parliament was over the nature of that relationship. How confrontational to be with North Korea? What should the relationship with China be? So all of these things are in flux. And so that's why the United States sort of hopes for stability, hopes the political system moves forward so that we can reestablish a relationship with President Yoon or whoever comes next, with it, I think is quite likely.
You know, South Korea is a democracy, so is it surprising that the president there would invoke such an undemocratic move to suppress the opposition?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it caught all of us off guard, right? This isn't what democracies do. They don't come up and the president doesn't declare martial law and declare an end to open open politics and shut down the legislature. This was a dramatic deal, and it caught everybody, including many in South Korea, by surprise. So it's a big deal, and any sort of democracy always gets very, very worried when you see this because we realize how precarious a democratic system can be.
This is kind of, I'm going to throw some facts at you. I want you to weigh in here because these are some things that I just learned. There's some interesting factors at play in South Korea when it comes to politics, and much of that centers on gender equality. Some women there, some say that some women there have gained too much power in the political system, and others say that women still aren't represented in business and parliament, and there's widespread sexual violence against women there, things that I just didn't know about.
You know, there's some really interesting parallels between what's going on in the U.S. political system and what's going on in South Korea. They're having real conversations about gender and women's rights. And what we're seeing is some groups are pushing for an expansion of those rights and others are pushing back against. In general, the level of political dysfunction should feel very similar and comfortable to the United States. They have this sort of divided system that isn't able to get much done. But again, yeah, these questions about rights and human rights and women's rights are at the central of some of that political dysfunction, and that prevents them from thinking more broadly about international issues as well. So again, there's so many parallels between the United States and South Korea in terms of the functioning of the democracy.
Professor William Muck from North Central College, thank you.
Thanks for having me.